It's very nice to be here, and also thank you all for showing up in spite of the cold and the rain. So that is appreciated. So today the title of the talk, as you can see, is Fiscal Policy Procyclicality Theory and Evidence. So let me just say very briefly why I thought about talking about this issue here today. The first reason is that as I hope to have you convinced by the end of the talk, the issue of fiscal macrostabilization in emerging countries and developing countries, that I'm going to use interchangeably, is to me the most important macro fiscal stabilization issue that has been faced by emerging markets in the last 20 years. And this is not a hyperbole. I'm not trying to be scary or anything, but this to me has been the most important topic, the most important issue in macro stabilization. And let's just be very clear from the start that when we talk about macro fiscal stabilization, we are talking about how fiscal policy is conducted over the business cycle, okay? So that is what macro stabilization is all about. So we are not here to talk about the relationship between fiscal policy and, say, long-run growth. That is a completely different topic that we are not going to be concerned with. Okay, and the second reason that I thought it would be nice to talk about this topic is that this is a topic very, very dear to my heart, if I may say so and confess so. This is a topic that I have been working with many co-authors that you'll see as we proceed with the presentation for the last 20 years or so. So I thought that this was a very nice opportunity to take stock of what do we know about fiscal policy cyclicality, and how do we know what we know, and what is the implication of what we know for all future future research in this area. So I would like to leave you at the end of this lecture also with the idea that there is a lot more to do. The fact that we have been working for 20 years in this topic only means that we have been scratching the surface. So for people who are familiar with this topic or may not be familiar, but today they may like the topic and so forth, this is a very nice topic to do research on, because it is very rich, as you'll see, and I'll have to be very brief, of course, but it is very rich in the three categories that are considered essential to do good research. And the first is that we have a lot of empirical evidence that we'll talk a little bit about, that we have a lot of theoretical evidence to explain the econometric evidence that we'll talk today, and that will end up talking about fiscal policy rules. That in some sense it is a very natural bridge from what we'll see today to what I would call the frontier research from today, because fiscal policy rule is a critical issue for a public policy fiscal recommendation. So that's very good for a public policy school, but also for any econ department, and all the cutting edge research that is being done today is mostly speaking on fiscal rules. So I hope to sort of cover all of that. Okay, so what I am planning to do is to organize the talk around 4 key questions. Okay, so the first question that we are planning to ask is how is fiscal policy conducted over the business cycle, right? And it's very important that I didn't say, and on purpose, how should fiscal policy should be conducted over the business cycle. I'm saying how is fiscal policy conducted over the business cycle, and that is key because there is going to be a huge puzzle that I am going to put on the table, that is the most important puzzle in this literature, that is the fact why do emerging markets conduct fiscal policy in a way that they should not. Okay, so that is going to be a big question. And here the second question, and here I have to give a spoiler alert. When I put the second question, if you are paying attention, as you know, as I know you all do, of course. The second question is, why is fiscal policy procyclical in emerging markets? So that from that you can already infer that the answer to question 1 is that fiscal policy in emerging market is going to be procyclical compared to fiscal policy in OECD countries that is going to be either cyclical or counter-cyclical. And the question is going to be, why in the world would any fiscal authority want to pursue procyclical fiscal policy? What is procyclical fiscal policy? We'll talk more about that, but it is important from the going to be very clear. So procyclical fiscal policy is simply fiscal policy that is expansionary in good times, and it is contractionary in bad times, right? So that means that procyclical fiscal policy is amplifying the business cycle of emerging countries. So the question is, why in the world would the fiscal authorities want to make an already very volatile cycle even more volatile by pumping fiscal spending in good times and by contracting fiscal policy in bad times, right? And the obvious answer is that policymakers in emerging markets don't know what they are doing is, I think that it can be ruled out completely. It is not a matter that they don't know what is good and what is bad. These are policymakers that study in the same places that we study. They know what they're talking about. So there must be some what we call frictions in the underlying fiscal policy that are responsible to lead the fiscal authority to act in a procyclical way. Okay, so the third question is, are there countries that have graduated? So what do we mean by graduation? We mean countries that have been able to switch from being procyclical to being countercyclical. The best example of graduation that I'm going to refer at several points in the presentation is the case of Chile. Here we have a member of the faculty that is from Chile, so he'll be happy, I hope, that to hear very nice things about Chile. So Chile is going to be our poster boy of a country that, as I am going to show you, was procyclical during 20 years or so, and then was able to graduate and become countercyclical. So it is important to understand that all this discussion of fiscal procyclicality is not a static phenomenon. It is a it is a dynamic phenomenon that is taking place over time, and therefore it is important to understand what are those dynamics that may happen over time. And the fourth, having talked about the three big things, I mean, I think that are the most important in the last 20 years in this particular literature, to conclude this lecture by talking about what are the implications for fiscal rules. Okay, so before we answer the first question, I want to make sure that we are on the same page. So the question here, which is not obvious if you have not faced this topic before or have not thought about it before, is how are we going to define the cyclical properties of fiscal policy. And here the key is that we want to define the fiscal behavior of fiscal policy based on the instruments of fiscal policy that the fiscal authority can control. And as we know, in principle, I say in principle because in practice there may be some other things that we are not going to talk about, but I mean, if you look at your standard fiscal policy model, the two key fiscal policy instruments are fiscal spending and tax rate. So this is very important, and that is why I put it in italics, and tax rate as opposed to tax revenues, because as we all know, tax revenues is going to be the product of tax rates times the tax base, right? Because the tax base, as we know, is very elastic to the business cycle. So if we have a country like Chile that has an increasing copper prices, even if they keep the tax rate constant, the copper price is going to increase so much that there is going to be a big increase in tax revenues in good times, and a very sharp fall in tax revenues in bad times. And believe it or not, there are still, even though I have tried very hard to convince people of this, and I think I may have convinced some, but not others, some people still use tax revenues as opposed to tax rate to measure the degree of fiscal procyclicality on the taxation side, and that is wrong, because even if you cyclically adjust by the business cycle, what you are left with is not this discretionary fiscal spending that you can interpret as a tax rate. So if you ever read or do something about that, use tax rates. Never use tax revenues, okay? Okay, so now let us go to the definitions that we'll use in this presentation. As I said, we define procyclical fiscal policy as a fiscal policy that is going to amplify the cycle, meaning that it makes the economic booms more pronounced and the economic recessions deeper. So let us just focus on expansionary in good times. That means that when we look at the data, and we look at the data in the next slide, the correlation between cyclical components, okay? So these are not the trends, these are not the actual series, these are the cyclical components because we are talking about macro stabilization policies that is all about the cycle, okay? So no trend here. So if this correlation is positive, it means that when the cyclical component of GDP is high, G is also high, right? That means that is going to amplify the business cycle, and therefore this correlation should be positive. And the same is true with the tax rate, but the correlation is going to be negative simply because now to be expansionary in terms of tax rates implies that if GDP falls, tax rate has to fall to stimulate the economy, okay? So this is what pro-cyclical fiscal policy is. Then, I mean, we have only 3 possibilities here, so it's very clear. I mean, when we talk about the cyclicality of fiscal policy, only 3 things can happen. You are either pro-cyclical, counter-cyclical, or acyclical. That is it. So what is the cyclical fiscal policy? I mean, if you want to imagine a stochastic world, it is when fiscal policy is independent of the business cycle, meaning that the correlation between G and GDP is not going to be significantly different from zero, and the same is true of the correlation between G and GDP. And just to complete this taxonomy, we get to countercyclical fiscal policy. So when we look at the data, we'll see some procyclical, some acyclical, and some countercyclical. This countercyclical is should be the easier for you to relate to, because if you just took the first course in macro, I mean, I'm sure that they talk to you about the Keynesian model, sticky prices model, who calls for a countercyclical fiscal policy, which means that when times are bad, you want to have an expansionary fiscal policy in bad times, as happened during the global financial crisis of 08, 09, and also just happened during the pandemic, in which the amount of countercyclical fiscal policy was the biggest in the history of the world. Okay, so that is very important, just to keep our things straight. Okay, so now we are going back to the first question: how is fiscal policy conducted over the business cycle? And this is perhaps the most important plot of the whole presentation. So if you have to keep one plot in mind tonight as you fall asleep, I hope that this is going to be it. Let me say that I am originally from Uruguay in South America. So me, my co-authors, and many other people call these the plots de Peñarol. Why? Because Peñarol is the soccer team that I am a fan of. It used to be one of the best soccer teams in the whole world, and the colors in the Peñarol jersey are yellow and black. So just recall plots de Peñarol and you'll be fine. Okay, so here we have to spend a couple of minutes, because if we understand this, then all that comes is going to be much easier. So here we have 123 countries, 101 developing countries, and 22 OECD countries. The OECD in its original formulation. So the height of each of these bars is the correlation of the cyclical component of G with GDP. Okay, so for instance, and I have referred to some country here just to have some application to talk about. If you look at Chile, this is about 0.25. So that means that Chile, for the period 1960-2020, so for the period of 60 years, its average correlation between the cyclical components has been 0.25. For the case of the US, that we expect the US to be counter-cyclical, because that's what the US does, you know, it is about minus 0.25. Recall, of course, that if you have a positive correlation between these two cyclical components, it means that you are pro-cyclical. If you are if you have a negative correlation between the two, it means that you have been countercyclical, right? And here, I mean, if it ever applied, this idea that a picture is worth a 1,000 words, it really applies, because if you look, all the mass, yellow mass is on this side of the board, meaning that about 80% of more of developing countries, of emerging countries, has been procyclical on average for these 60 years. Okay? And you can see that the black bars are, with a couple of exceptions here, are all on this part of the board. This means that all the OECD countries on average have been counter cyclical. I want to point out that it's very interesting. Here I have the flag for Greece, and here I have the flag for Portugal, and these are the two OECD countries that have the most procyclicality. This should not come as a surprise. I mean, I hope that we don't have any economists from Greece and Portugal today, but I think it is fair to say that both Greece and Portugal, in particular over the last 20 years, conventional wisdom would say that they have behaved very much more like emerging countries than like OECD countries. And this is completely consistent with Greece and Portugal, and this simply is an average of all the correlations of the non-OECD is 0.29, highly significant at the 1%, and for the OECD minus 0.12. Okay, so key idea, I mean, again, if this is all that you're going to remember from this talk, this is it. So the key idea is that if you take the last 60 years, which is a long period of time, fiscal policy in emerging markets have been procyclical. Fiscal policy in OECD countries has been counter cyclical. Okay, so here I'm going to speed up a little bit, because here is the same idea, but this is important from a data point of view. It is very easy to get data for public spending. You just go to the IMF website and you have all the data for public spending there. You don't have data on tax rates in IFS or in the World Bank. So here you have to go to domestic sources and literally replicate the time series for all the taxes. So this is very time consuming, and we have done a lot of work on this. So here just let me point that here if you have if you have a negative value between the cyclical component of the tax rate and GDP, it means that you are pro-cyclical on the taxation side. If you have a positive, you are counter-cyclical, and you can see once again that almost all the yellow mass is here. And just what we have done to check the thing, because this plot is only for the VAT, we constructed a weighted average tax index that comprises the VAT, the personal income tax, and the corporate income tax. And as you can see, the correlation for developing countries is minus 0.28 and highly significant, which means that emerging markets have also been procyclical on the taxation side, whereas for the case of industrial cases, the coefficient is not significantly different from 0. So here we conclude that fiscal policy on the taxation side has been procyclical in emerging markets, and at least for this sample has been acyclical for OECD countries. So here very quickly you can ask the question, because that is a very natural question to ask, if a country is procyclical on the spending side, will it also be procyclical on the taxation side? Okay? Because obviously we believe that should be the case, right? Because if a country misbehaves on the spending side, we should expect that it misbehave on the taxation side. And this plot shows that the more procyclical you are on the spending side, the more procyclical you also are on the taxation side. Okay, so here we are going to switch a little bit, because this is going to be critical for when we talk about policy rules. Okay, so up to now we have talked about procyclicality at the national level, right? Meaning if you look at the fiscal policy of the federal government, what does it do? Okay, but what happens if, for instance, for the case of Argentina, we look at the subnational, meaning we look at the procyclicality of each of the 23 provinces of Argentina. You can see that all except one are procyclical. This is not surprising, because we believe that Argentina is not a very well managed country. So if it has a huge procyclicality for federal spending, I mean, we should expect fiscal procyclicality for at the sub-national level. Okay, but this should surprise you. So I hope that it does surprise you a lot, because this is the US. And if I didn't tell you that it is the US, you would have you would have never been able to guess. So this is the procyclicality for every state in the US. The mean correlation is 0.43. The mean correlation for Argentina was 0.46. So there is no distinction between perhaps the best macro managed country in the world and Argentina. When it comes to the subnational level, they are both extremely procyclical. So how can that be? Well, and the explanation is going to be that the reason why the US states have been so procyclical is because at the end of the 19th century there was a series of financial crises in the US, and policymakers, for some reason that economic historians should explain, took the decision that the financial crisis had to do with fiscal indiscipline, and they imposed a fiscal rule of having a zero balance budget in every period. And we'll come back to this, but if you think for a second, that is going to maximize the procyclicality, right? Because if I force you to have I mean, think about your income and expense. I mean, if I force you to balance that, it means that if you earn 10, you have to spend 10 to fulfill the zero actual balance requirement, and that implies, in terms of correlation, that the correlation is going to be equal to 1. So if you impose this rule, you are maximizing the procyclicality. And this is an issue that is not well appreciated at all. People keep blaming the states, they are very procyclical. Well, they are very procyclical because the state's constitution are forcing them to be. Okay, so so now we go to question 2. So here I'll have to go a little bit faster. So here the question is why is fiscal procyclical in developing countries, right? And here really the important thing, because this you can read if this is a topic that interests you. Please feel free to mail me if you want papers, if you want anything. I'll be happy to answer or to send you material. So the first that encompasses several explanations, but the common thread is the lack of access to international credit market, right? And here the explanation is very easy. If you are in bad times, which means that because the tax rate has plummeted, you have a primary fiscal deficit, and you cannot borrow from abroad. Guess what? You have to cut spending and raise taxes. That is procyclical policy. So there are a series of theoretical models that do it with the optimal fiscal policy, Lucas, Toque, and so forth, but you don't even you don't even need to know about that. This is the key idea. And then the second set of explanations are all political economy explanations. So for those of you that like to mix or to look at the interaction between macro-fiscal and political economy interaction, this is something that may be of particular interest. So here the common thing is that when there is a lot of money in the coffers of the Treasury, it is very difficult to say no. Okay? So, and there was a very famous Argentinian economics minister by the name of the Mingo Cavallo, who always said, I would rather return this money to the private sector than keep it in the hands of the public sector. Because if it is in the hands of the public sector, it is gonna be spent. Okay? So this is the illustration for the lack of access. Here we have a GDP that is low, so this is a bad time. This GDP is a good time. As we know, any small open economy model is going to tell you that you want to smooth consumption over time, and you are gonna smooth also public spending over time, and also the tax rate over time. So here you are gonna run a trade deficit, of course, simply because your GDP is less than your consumption, but you can finance this current account deficit by borrowing from abroad. But if you cannot borrow from abroad, which means that your trade deficit has to be equal to 0, it means that compared to this equilibrium, here you have to reduce G, and you have to increase the tax rate, and that is procyclical fiscal policy. I'm gonna skip these two. This is just a more in-depth explanation of two political economy explanation. What is the voracity effect by Tornell and Lane. The other one is one that we studied with Talby. I am gonna skip that. You can take a look of this. I'll be happy to send you the paper. Because of lack of time, and because the fundamental idea is the same. If you have too much money in good times, there are going to be so many political pressure to spend that you are not going to be able to resist. Not only that, but you would like to reduce tax rate so as to shrink the primary surplus so that you can reduce the political economy pressure to spend. Okay? Okay, so question 3. Are there countries that have graduated? The answer is gonna be yes. And here we just have to look at the plots de Peñarol before the year 2000 and after the year 2000. It doesn't matter if you choose 2003, 2004. I mean, that is a good year. As you can see, this plot is very similar to plot to the first plot that we look, which is not surprising since this is covering 40 years from 1960 to 2000, and this is covering from 2000 to 2020. And here the only important observation is that you can see that here you have much less yellow mass than here, which means that there must be a lot of countries that before 2000 used to be here and are now here. And that is because they have graduated in the sense that they have been able to switch from procyclicality to counter cyclicality, and we can compute that the graduation rate is 22%. So we can discuss how big is 22, but 22 is 22. It means that we have 1/5 of countries that have been able to graduate. And if I show you this for after the year 2007-8, we will have, I think, like 42%. Okay? Okay, so now this is a different way of thinking about graduation. Here we take the plane and we divide the plane in 4 quadrants. So here is the correlation of G and GDP before, and here is the correlation of G and GDP after, right? And here we have 4 categories. One is the what we call the established graduates. So these are people that have obtained their Ph.D. and still have their Ph.D. at home and feel very proud about it. And for instance, here you expect to see almost all OECD countries, right? Here you have the US, Australia, France, Canada, blah, blah, blah. Then you have here, which is the most important quadrant from the point of view that we want to make. These are the recent graduates. These are the countries that used to be procyclical in the old days between 1960 and 1999, and now after 2000 have turned and become countercyclical. Okay, and the poster boy, we'll talk a little bit more, is Chile. So Chile is a country that has graduated, but as you can see, it is not the only one. Then we have what we call still in school. This still in school means, and here Argentina is not surprisingly here, since Argentina is not a paragon of macro stability, if I may say so. So still in school means that you used to be procyclical and you continue to be procyclical. There has been no change, and Greece falls here, and I have to confess that my home country, Uruguay, is also in the category of still in school. Okay, so this is just under 22% are these countries here. I mean, countries that are the recent recent graduates. Okay, so here, and we are entering the last part of the talk. So the question is, how can we explain why graduation takes place in some countries and not in others, right? I mean, this is not that you toss a coin and you are procyclical if it is tails or countercyclical if it is head. In the literature, the more convincing explanation has been to tie it to the importance of institutions. And there are papers that show very clear, this here on the bottom is the institutional quality index that you can get from the World Bank. So this says that the higher the institutional quality index, the less procyclical is public spending, right? And you may ask, okay, can you tell me some samples of what it means, institution? Yeah, here I put institution among other things, include fiscal rule, fiscal council, commodity stabilization fund, government stability, quality of bureaucracy. There are many indices, and this is all in papers if you want to take a look. But here the idea is that if you manage to improve your institutional quality, that is a very important impetus for you to be able to graduate. Okay, so here, since we have been Chile on the class, since we have been talking about Chile on the class, I think of Chile just to fix ideas, and because it is true that Chile in this back to school, in school or still in school, whatever, is the star of the class. I mean the start of the class, because here what we have is what we call the to any year rolling window. So what we do to see a dynamic pattern as opposed to one single number for 60 years is to compute the correlation and the institutional quality for the previous 20 years. So that is why the sample starts in 1984 as opposed to 1960, because we take the first 20 years to compute this, right? So here what is interesting is that you can see how Chile is the poster boy of this idea of graduation, because from a 0.4 positive, meaning that Chile was very pro-cyclical in 1994, here in the year 2000 it becomes counter-cyclical, and now it is basically acyclical. So this I like to think of the poster boy. This is how one would like to see all the countries behave like that. And here there is some very important institutional change. I am not saying that it is the only one, but look at this huge jump, right? So here Chile literally jumps from a procyclicality of 0.2 to becoming countercyclical, and right now it is minus 0.3 procyclical. So huge fall in the procyclicality that becomes countercyclicality as the quality of the institutions go up. And this is key because it was in the year 2000 that Chile implemented the structural balance budget rule, and we'll talk about that. So Argentina I want to put on the other side of the spectrum. If Chile is the poster boy, the best student in the class, I see Argentina like the worst student, and I love Argentina. Okay, so don't get me wrong. You see, but Argentina went from almost acyclical, 0.1 in 1984, to 0.6 in 2017 as the quality of its institutions keep on deteriorating. Okay, so to complete the question 4, what are the policy implications of fiscal rules? So now, I mean, for those of you who follow a little bit, it has become extremely common to implement fiscal rule, to the point that it is almost very difficult to find more than a few emerging or developing countries that do not have a fiscal rule. So fiscal rule has become very common, and there can be very different fiscal rules. Fiscal rules on the actual primary balance or deficit. This is the case that we discussed about the U.S. states. Fiscal rule based on a structural primary deficit. I mean, Chile was the pioneer here, and I'm happy to report that in the case of Uruguay, as of last year, we have also implemented a fiscal rule based on the structural primary deficit. I mean, structural, we'll talk a little bit more about this, but simply means that you have to correct for the business cycle, and in the case of Chile, you have to correct for copper prices. Then you have a fiscal rule like in Brazil. Let us see how much this lasts, that are based on putting a cap on public spending and also putting a cap on debt to GDP. So here, and you know, this I wish that also together with Plot de Peñarol, this is the other idea. So here the worst rule is the first one, meaning this one. This is the rule that we saw for the U.S. states. It is the worst. I mean, you can show with pen and pad that if I ask, and this is a question that I have asked my students in science, tell me what is the fiscal rule that maximizes procyclicality, and the response is the fiscal rule that says that your actual balance has to be 0. That has a correlation of -1. You cannot get more procyclical than that. And in spite of that, there are institutions which are well known, that the IMF, and I was at the IMF for many years, I'm not responsible for this, but the IMF, for instance, to my surprise, still puts, combines rules based on the actual deficit with rules based on the structural deficit. As though these rules are the same, and these are completely different rules. Okay, so, and what is the best rule? What Chile does? This one. And what Uruguay is doing now. You have your primary surplus. You know that you cannot spend that because because the economy in the world is booming, because copper price is booming. So what you do is to correct what you see by the cycle and by copper. You get to the conclusion that the structural fiscal deficit is equal to 0, and therefore you cannot spend a single dime. So a structural fiscal rule forces you to save every single cent in good times and to save in bad times. And this is it can be shown mathematically in the context of an optimum fiscal policy model. It is very easy to do that. This is by far the best rule, and not only that, it actually replicates the first best. So I'm going to skip on the Chilean recipe because these are things that we have already talked. And to conclude, so that there is some time to ask a question, what are the conclusions? As I said at the beginning, in my view, procyclical fiscal policy is as opposed to micro fiscal policy, right? Which of course is complicated, but this is about macro fiscal stabilization, has been and continues to be the most important problem in emerging markets in the last 60 years and certainly in the last 20 years. So procyclical fiscal policy amplifies the business cycle, what we have called the phenomenon of when it rains, it pours. Fiscal rules have proved to be quite helpful in overcoming fiscal procyclicality, as we have discussed, and I'm going to leave you with this thought, which is but in the final analysis, there is no fiscal rule in the world that is going to solve the problem if there is not the political will in the Treasury or the Congress or wherever the authority lies. If the politicians are not convinced that they need to be disciplined, you can put 10 rules at the same time. It ain't gonna work. So fiscal rules are very helpful when you have a consensus in society that you have to escape the fiscal procyclicality trap, and what you have to have and what you want to have is a conceptual mechanical apparatus that is gonna help you with that. But fiscal rules are not a panacea. Still the politicians have to be convinced that it is the best to have a disciplined fiscal policy, meaning a fiscal policy that is either acyclical or counter-cyclical. Thank you so much.